They call it the king of instruments. It's everywhere, right? Concert halls, your living room, and it can do anything from the softest whisper to a thunderous roar. But the piano we have today is actually the result of this dramatic 300-year battle between artists and engineers. So let's dive into that revolution.
I mean, just listen to world-renowned artists like Daniel Barenboim. He talks about the modern piano like it's an extension of his own body, an incomparable tool for getting his emotions out. It really is the peak of acoustic engineering.
But here's the thing, it wasn't always like this. Not even close. The very first pianos were described as quiet, kind of muted actually. So how do we get from this delicate little instrument to the powerhouse we see on stage today? Well, the whole story starts with a simple but really fundamental problem.
Okay, so let's jump back to the beginning. We're talking about the core problem here, volume. Before the piano existed, composers in the 18th century were facing a major creative roadblock.
They basically had two main keyboard choices. On the one hand, you've got the harpsichord. Yep, it was loud, it was brilliant, perfect for filling a big room with sound. But its strings were plucked. That means every note was the exact same volume, no matter how you hit the key. It had power, sure, but zero dynamic emotion. On the other hand, there was the clavichord. Now this one was incredibly expressive. You could totally control the volume with your touch, but it was so quiet, it was pretty much useless in a concert. So you had this choice, loud or emotional. You just couldn't get both.
That is, until an instrument keeper for the Medici family down in Florence, Italy, decided, you know what, this is a problem worth solving. And his name was Bartolomeo Cristofori. And that brings us to Chapter 2, Cristofori's absolutely brilliant solution. He didn't just tweak an old design, he came up with something completely new.
He called his invention the gravicembalo co piano e forte, which literally means the harpsichord with soft and loud. Of course, that got shortened pretty quick to forte piano, a name that perfectly described what it did. See, instead of plucking the strings, Cristofori came up with this mechanism where a little hammer would strike them. And here's the crucial part. How fast you pressed the key controlled how hard the hammer hit. Finally, the player had control over the volume.
What's just amazing is how brilliant Cristofori's first design was. It had three core pieces that are still used in modern pianos. First, the hammer hits the string. Second, a clever little thing called an escapement lets the hammer immediately drop away so the string can vibrate freely. And third, a damper falls back onto the string to stop the sound the moment you let go of the key. He basically solved all the fundamental problems of the piano on his very first try. Incredible!
Now, Cristofori's fortepiano was absolutely perfect for the elegant, refined music of Mozart's time. But music was changing. And that leads to the next big phase in the piano's evolution, Beethoven's demands. A whole new generation of composers needed an instrument with way more fire.
And then, along comes Ludwig van Beethoven. This guy didn't just play the piano, he attacked it. Music was moving out of small private salons and into huge public concert halls, and Beethoven needed an instrument that could keep up with his explosive music. The delicate wooden-framed fortepianos of the day, they just fell apart under his ferocious style. He needed more power, more range, more of everything.
And you know what? Manufacturers listened. The piano went through this period of super rapid evolution. The keyboard stretched out from 5 octaves in the 1790s to 6, and then to 7 octaves by the 1820s. That meant you could have these thundering low notes and soaring high melodies. The frames were beefed up to handle thicker strings and way more tension. This wasn't just evolution anymore. It was like an arms race, and it was all fueled by artists like Beethoven.
And that arms race was just about to get way more intense. The Industrial Revolution came along and kicked the whole thing into high gear, sparking what you could basically call the Piano Wars, a time of fierce competition and just radical innovation. 3 major hubs of innovation popped up. Over in London, you had Broadwood building these powerful, sturdy pianos and helping to standardize the pedals. In Paris, a guy named Sebastian Erard was proving to be a total mechanical genius. And then in New York, a German immigrant named Heinrich Steinweg, you probably know him as Steinway, would end up perfecting the whole thing. Each one of them brought a total game changer to the table.
Erard's invention was just monumental. In 1821, he came up with this double escapement action. It was this mechanism that let a player repeat a note incredibly fast without having to fully lift their finger off the key. This one invention unlocked a whole new level of jaw-dropping virtuosity, and it's what made the breathtaking music of composers like Liszt and Chopin even possible.
Meanwhile, over in America, Steinway & Sons were completely rethinking the piano's internal structure. Instead of just laying all the strings side by side, they developed cross-stringing, where the long bass strings sweep diagonally over the top of the treble strings. This genius idea let them fit longer, richer-sounding bass strings inside the case, and that created a much more powerful and resonant sound.
But Steinway's biggest breakthrough, the real game changer, was perfecting the single-piece cast iron frame. This thing could withstand an unbelievable amount of force. Get this, a modern concert grand has over 20 tons of string tension pulling on it at all times. That's the weight of about 15 cars. An iron frame was the only thing strong enough to handle all that power, and it became the foundation for the modern piano sound. So, by the late 19th century, the piano wars were pretty much over. And that brings us to our final chapter, the birth of the modern grand. One design had really emerged as the clear winner, creating the blueprint for almost every single grand piano that's been made since. You could call it the Steinway paradigm. It basically combined all the most successful innovations into one perfect design. You had the massive cast iron frame, the rich sound from cross-stringing, Arid's lightning-fast double escapement action, felt-covered hammers for a huge dynamic range, and of course the now standard 88-key keyboard. This was it. This became the global standard.
So, by the early 1900s, the fundamental evolution of the piano was basically done. The 20th century wasn't really about radical reinvention anymore. It was all about perfection. Makers like Yamaha, Bosendorfer, and Fazioli, they focused on precision, consistency, and developing their own unique tonal personalities, all while working from that same established blueprint.
Which of course brings us to today. The piano went from a quiet little instrument that could play soft and loud to a technological marvel that can withstand 20 tons of tension to create this incredible range of sound. It was a journey totally driven by the demands of art. So I guess the question is, after 3 whole centuries of constant, revolutionary change, is the story of the piano finally finished?